We plan to post the session on our YouTube channel, and we'll also email you a link to the recording and the slides after the presentation. Please be sure to keep your cameras off and your microphone muted for today's presentation. You can type questions you have for the presenters and panelists into the chat at any time. The chat will be monitored for questions, and the questions will be read out loud at the end of today's presentation. We also have closed captioning with auto transcription available for this presentation. And there is a link to the slides in the chat, or will be shortly. Heather Welton from HathiTrust will be providing technical support for this session. So if you're having any technical issues with Zoom, you can send a private chat message to her and she will assist you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Dubnicek, Digital Humanities Specialist at the HathiTrust Research Center, to start our session.
Thanks, Aaron. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. The sort of outline of what we'll be talking about today is I'll give a brief introduction to the HathiTrust Research Center's Advanced Collaborative Support Program. And I do mean brief, and then we'll dive into our presenters today who are current and past ACS awardee recipients. We'll be speaking with Aduramo Lasode and Cody Hennessy at the University of Minnesota, Stephen Krewson from Yale University, Matt Yoder and Dmitry Mozzherin, of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, Laure Thompson from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then we'll end with a Q&A moderated by Glenn Worthy, our Associate Director of Research Support Services at the HathiTrust Research Center. Good in advance. Introduction. So as promised, what is the Advanced Collaborative Support Program? That's the kind of first obvious question here. But this is a program that competitively awards grants of time and resources. So this is both staff time and compute resources. Sometimes it's access to perhaps prototype tools or services from HathiTrust Research Center. But in this case, no money is changing hands with our ACS program. So researchers may come to us and say, we'd like to explore this research question using the HathiTrust corpus. But we need a little bit of help, or we're not quite sure what methods will work to answer this research question. So HTRC staff using our compute resources at Indiana University will go about tackling that problem. So this program began in 2015. We've had about 5 rounds of awards. We've supported over 20 projects, and we've tried to target research projects across many different domains. If you follow the link there on the slide to the HTRC wiki, you'll see small abstracts for each of the projects that we've supported over time, as well as links to their final reports in almost every instance. And then in some instances, you'll also have some mid-report blog posts. Before I dive into the C for collaborative, one of the examples, which we won't be talking about today, is on screen here, which is this is a style card that was generated as part of the University of Iowa's Program Era Project ACS Award. And they were looking at the Iowa Writers Workshop, people who are affiliated with that program, both students and teachers, to get a sense of how these authors may differ compared to their peers. So one part of the process was to generate essentially baseball cards for authors. So what we have on screen is Kurt Vonnegut versus Philip Roth. And this is an example of the types of projects over time that we've supported. If you'd like to read more about that particular project, they did a couple of really great blog posts about their findings, one of which is linked on the slide. So as I said, there is a reason that collaborative is in the name, right? This program has been approached not as a traditional grant and grantee sort of relationship, but a collaborative research project relationship. I think I've worked on most of these projects directly, and we see that as a true collaboration. So oftentimes we'll have a themed ACS call that may help HTRC demo or test out some new tools or services, or perhaps help us test out certain kinds of ideas that may end up being tools or services. In the past, we've built in, since I mentioned on the slide, ACS has become a model for successful research with HTRC. And this program has in fact become a model for some of our funded grant research as well, where the first workset creation for scholarly analysis project, we used a very similar mechanism for finding research partners. And we may have a little bit more to share with you on that point at the end of the project. So with no further ado, we're going to kick things off. Oh yeah, sorry. Let me say this too. If you have a question about the ACS program, email us. It can be stuff about logistics, about general questions about the program, like how often do we apply? Do you have to be from a member institution? All this, or if you have a specific idea that you just want to gauge if this is possible or something we may be interested in, feel free to reach out to us at acs@HathiTrust.org. Of course, if you have any general questions, it wouldn't be an HTRC slide presentation without HTRC-help@HathiTrust.org. Feel free to send us an email. All right, so now without further ado, we're going to dive into our first project, which is from Aduramo, Lasode, and Cody Hennessy at the University of Minnesota.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ryan, for introducing me earlier. Just a little bit of background. I am from the University of Minnesota and from a mechanical engineering background. And my project is one of the 2020 projects awarded earlier this year, actually this summer, surveying applicability of energy recovery technologies for waste treatment. Next slide, please. And so my project, because it's relatively new this year, it's still in progress, and I'll give a little bit of background over kind of the motivation for my work and some of the work that I've done with the center so far, and some highlights and next steps. So looking at waste and renewable energy, I know a lot of people are excited about energy, and probably I more than many. The idea behind my project is really looking at ways to expand the energy portfolio. There's been a lot of conversation in society, especially given climate studies or even change in weather patterns all over the world, and looking at how to mitigate some of these adverse effects. Renewable energy has become a more important topic. And so the idea of what we're looking into is how to leverage waste treatment in this energy efforts. Waste treatment generates some biogas or combustible gases that can be harnessed for power generation or other energy applications. And the technologies that typically are used in these efforts are called prime movers. Now, a challenge that we have currently in the waste treatment industry is a lot of the facilities in place or currently in use are centralized treatment, meaning waste from all manner of places come to one location and you treat it and do whatever you want there. As we look at the life cycle of that waste treatment process, we see that the transportation of waste itself adds to greenhouse gas emissions and some of those negative things that we don't want. And so there is a movement towards distributed waste systems, meaning waste is treated at the site of generation. Now, that is all well and good. We could dream about that, but in bringing that into fruition and implementation, there are a lot of factors that impact this movement. And some of that is really looking at these technologies that can be used to generate power have cost factors, efficiency factors, fuel use factors, things that affect implementation. In addition to the scientific side of we can do an analysis and say this is the great technology, there's also some policy aspects that impact these technology implementations. Now, part of my work, my research, I did an initial study on how do we decouple these factors, because I mentioned a few, there's a lot more, and they're all integrated. And so how do we clearly state this is how efficiency impacts implementation of a technology, or this is how this policy impacts the use of this technology. So what I have done in the past is really looking at a data-driven approach to making some of these decisions. And that includes looking at what technologies are commercially available, what studies have been reported in the past, what are the numerical values for some of these factors that have been presented in past literature, and how do we analyze that to create a model that can help make these decisions easier and more straightforward. Now, the projected impact of this study, which I should mention is part of my dissertation as well as a PhD candidate. Some of this projected impact is to help real life applications in waste treatment have an easy way to choose the technology that they want to implement. That's phase one. The second phase is really seeing that in the industry, as we transition from centralized treatment to distributed treatment, we don't have all the technology power that we can, that we need. And we need to identify those areas for innovation, and being able to clearly present what is currently out there, what is available, helps to highlight those gaps as well. Next slide, please. And so coming into the HTRC, some of the parameters that I brought along with my project is looking at six main technologies in waste treatment. So five of them are listed in the table on the right: gas turbines, steam turbines, micro turbines, reciprocating engines. These are like diesel engines and engines you would see in a car, for example, and also fuel cells. In addition to that, we're looking at Stirling engine, which is kind of historic and coming back gradually. Also looking at year of relevance, 1900s was when prime movers became more of a bigger deal, and up until 2020. Major factors being evaluated here: efficiency, cost, and full utilization. And the table on the right really just shows this is the expected data outcome of this project. Next slide, please. Now, some of the preliminary work that has been done so far is identifying volumes of interest in the collection of the center, of the research center, and really looking at in what way is the information presented? Is there a way that we can really streamline this, because there are millions of volumes in the collection, and what is relevant to these technologies, to these factors, and how do we make the computational work easier? Now, part of that, or the next stage that we're really in right now, is testing extraction methods. So this project is a little bit unique in that we're not just pulling out numbers independently. We're really looking at what's the connection between the values that we're pulling, and that presents unique challenges in itself. And the last piece is measuring the confidence, or coming up with ways to state the confidence in the methodology. Next slide, please. So now there's some highlights in this process. It's been an exciting journey for me, mentally challenging as well, just thinking about different ways of translating my initial study and manual work into text mining and computational work. And I have been fortunate to have the help of Cody, who is with the university libraries and brings expertise in digital library work. So Cody, if you could talk about some of the highlights.
Yeah, thanks, Adura. Yeah, so essentially we started off with these list of prime mover technologies and came up with, synonyms, acronyms, whatever we thought would get us to the volumes. And that initial corpus was like 1.3 million volumes, so a pretty significant set of data to work with. An initial sort of filter that we did were some pretty simple parameters using just sort of only looking at English language texts. We used some different bibliographic formats that we weren't interested in and removed those. So we didn't want to see musical scores, for example. And some of our initial acronyms were actually a little too not specific enough. So the reciprocating internal combustion engine is RICE. So we had a lot of cookbooks in that initial corpus that we did not necessarily want to be looking at. And so we got it down to, I think, 743,000 or about 744,000 volumes from there, which the technology matches were on over 6 million pages. So that's the corpus we were looking at there for a while. Adura and I did a fair amount of spot checking along with some folks on the HTRC team to see if we could look for patterns of kinds of books or volumes that were not going to be of interest. And we did come up with some more. So we saw a lot of standards publications, so the American National Standards, the NEMA standards, which we were able to filter out using title matches. We also saw a lot of environmental impact statements, which conveniently tend to always say, or often say, environmental impact statement in the title. So we were able to remove a lot of those with a title match. We also got rid of a lot of government documents that weren't really going to have the data that we needed, or if they did, it was going to be so rare that there'd just be too much noise. And we also filtered out a fair number of like bibliographies and some other formats using some MARC record field matches. And so it felt very satisfying to get rid of a lot of this noise. In the end, that only removed another like 10,600 volumes and another 53,000 pages, so about 1.5% of that 744,000 volumes. I'll pass it back to Adura for our next steps.
Mm-hmm. And so, like I mentioned before, we've moved now from really trying to identify that list to further analyze the filtered list. And we're moving on to extraction methods, really getting at the numerical data, the exact data. After that, it would be able to go on to further data analysis, which would go a long way towards the projected impact of the work that I discussed earlier. And just to give a feel of what that might look like, on the right, I have a figure that shows a flow chart. I call it a decision tree, where you're taking a system, a waste treatment system, and you're looking at some characteristics of that system and trying to make a decision as to what technology do you need to install to have good power generation. And so in this case, the system size, which could be, say, the volume of wastewater that you're treating at a site, goes into this flowchart. You can decide if you're on the smaller side, you might want to use a flow cell. If you're on the bigger side, you might use one of the turbines. And that's an example of the final output of this work. So now we can take, we're taking questions at the end. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thanks, Adura and Cody. We'll hand it off now to Stephen Krewson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Krewson. Glad to be here. I was a 2019 to 20 ACS grant participant, so it's so great to see work in progress. Mine will be a little bit more about work that's concluded, at least for this stage. I'm finishing up a PhD in the English department at Yale University, where I write about literature and education in the 19th century. And since 2019, I've been working full-time as a technical writer at Ab Initio Software in Massachusetts, but I plan to stay active in DH-type projects and use HathiTrust. Next slide, please. So as my title said, the project was deriving basic illustration metadata, and what we ended up with at the end of it were 2,584,888 image regions of interest from an initial data set of basically every volume in HathiTrust from 1800 to 1850 that was digitized by Google for a couple of different reasons, but that's the bulk of the volumes in that 50-year slice. And the way we ran our pipeline was such that those regions, those rectangular JPEGs, were illustrations from the books in those volumes. So that's just the kind of by the numbers of the biggest result we had. So as you can tell, HTRC collaboration is essential for working at that scale. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was a big number. I would like for you to have a sort of mental picture of how this worked for a given volume. in our set of about 183,000 volumes from our 50-year project period. So if you can see on the left in this image, first we did some work to figure out what pages in a book might feature illustrations, might have images on them. And it turns out there's some ways you can cut down the space of that problem by looking at metadata. It's typically derived from OCR data, where the OCR pass over the volume has said that there's a block that's probably a picture. So if you look at that and you only look at those pages, then you can use a retrained convolutional neural network. So it's sort of mini deep learning here. And from some previous projects, I had a model that kind of looked, it would take as input a scanned page from a HathiTrust volume and classify it according to one of 10 classes. So most of these were sort of junk or discoloration or the front and back cover of the book or like a marbled end paper of some kind. But the two we were interested in, the two that we kept in the next stage of the data pipeline here, were plate images and inline images. So in the 19th century, and it's true on either side of that, but the kind of main ways you'd see illustrations in a book would be to have a sort of tipped in full page image, maybe a copperplate engraving, or maybe a kind of arrangement of different scientific images, atlas style. And then what was much more common and was becoming more common in the period I'm studying, an inline image. So within the setting of the type on the page, you would have a wood block of some kind with a raised image on it, and that block would then be inked and part of the page. So we look at the candidate images that are likely to have illustrations. We do some work to find the ones that probably do have illustrations, and you can see that sort of in the third image there. And then we get a set of those illustrated pages, but then it's useful to cut out all the text because we're really interested in the illustrated region. So on the fourth image there, you can see that, from a book originally with 392 pages, we've cut down those pages to the ones with illustrations and then extracted 155 visual regions of interest is sort of the term in the computing literature on this, and that's done with a second model. Next slide, please. So that's just an image of what goes on. All right, so the project outcome, and that's again sort of by the numbers. I've mentioned these two stages. I won't bother reading that again. To get a sense of the scale of what we were working with, these roughly 2.6 million illustration crops was about, 553 gigabytes. So you gotta think before you start working with it at a full scale. And I'll talk about why it's probably better for research to take kind of a small snapshots of those and work on those. But yeah, so the current state of this data set of every book from 1800, 1850, every image extracted from that, totaling up to almost 600 gigabytes or 2.5 million JPEGs. That's sitting now in a private cloud bucket that I have, and I'm working on tools for going in with a more focused research question, looking at metadata files, particularly Hathi files, and then getting a subset of volumes from that 50-year period that you're interested in. And then the wonderful thing about that is that you already have a set of all the illustrations and nice bounding boxes of them for those books. So the case study I'll show today, very briefly, is of one particular publisher, educational publisher in Boston from the early 19th century. So what that allows you to do is kind of see the way that that publisher stratified the different books that they sold. And one of the ways you can do that is look at, well, where did they reuse wood engravings and other types of image assets that they had for less prestigious and cheaper books. And then I'll show a demo of one of the tools used to look at the actual images produced in the dataset. Next slide, please. All right, great. So this shows a snapshot of the PixPlot tool, and I'll post a link to the live demo so you can follow along and actually play with the PixPlot tool as we go. Yeah, the red squares I've added to mark some duplicate images. You're not gonna be able to see at this scale, but that's what they are. And I was able to generate this by, like I said, taking just a small snapshot of that big 2.5 million image data set that the ACS project produced. And so, like I said, this is for this publisher, Monroe and Francis. And so the image you'll see in the demo is about 1,300 images. So that's much more tractable. Okay, so let's take a look at a specific image. Oh, thank you. So this is a kind of one of the types of research questions that this data set allows you to kind of go down rabbit trails and generate some even more better posed questions. So this is a side-by-side look at the same wood engraving. It's based on a close copy of something by Alexander Anderson, who lived 1775 to 1870. He was an American physician and a wood engraver, active in New York City and one of the more prolific illustrators of the early 19th century in the US, kind of in the school of Thomas and John Buick from England. And so on the left, we have one of the many hundreds of editions of Robinson Crusoe that came out since its publication in the early 18th century. And this one's from the late 1830s. Robinson Crusoe, et cetera, with new engravings on wood by Anderson. And that's the Alexander Anderson I mentioned. Now on the right, we have a book called Paul Preston's Voyages. Now this was written pseudonymously by someone named Thomas Picton, a journalist, writer, kind of a magazine person based in New York. His dates are 1822 to 1891. And it's completely derivative of Crusoe. It's a kind of kid's book with an older narrator and two friends that go all over the world and have adventures. And one of the things they see, lo and behold, is a ship catching on fire and blowing up in the same way that Crusoe does. For what it's worth, this particular episode, which I kind of just found at random as one of the duplicates that PixPlot allowed me to see, is from the Farther Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. So it's not going to be in the more famous first volume. But let's carry on to the next slide. This is, of course, a more, it's a visual exploration tool. So the point is to not get too bogged down in the exact details of who's copying who, but to get a sense of the kind of research questions that can be generated. So here you can read or take a glance at the text kind of surrounding or contextualizing that image of the ship blowing up, the sort of exciting scene. And then we'll see in the next slide how Paul Preston's Voyages, which is much like all the Peter Parley books or any number of other 19th century kind of didactic juvenile fiction series, the whole purpose of it was to create text that could kind of be hung on the scaffolding of all these existing images from the Robinson Crusoe book that the publisher, in this case Monroe and Francis, already had. And this Thomas Picton fellow is kind of giving up the game here in this quote. So he has his main character, this boy, say, "Often and often have we visited together the hut that we built in the coppice in imitation of Robinson Crusoe," and that wood engraving is on the right. And of course, that wood engraving is from the Robinson Crusoe text from several years before. So this is the kind of thing that the data set from our project, combined with a good, effective tool like PixPlot, which we'll see shortly, allows you to find, and then you can start thinking about, maybe more rigorous questions, like for a given publisher, how many of their books could we characterize as this sort of derivative text where a sort of hack writer has just written text around an existing set of publications? And then for me will be a next step, more interestingly perhaps, between publishers, maybe from the same city or from the same region, or even between publishers on different sides of the Atlantic, for instance, do we see this kind of copying. Okay, next slide. All right, great. So I am wondering if you're going to be able to click on that. I don't think so. So I'm going to post it in the chat to everyone. So in the chat, you should get a link, and Boris Kapitanu has helpfully set up an instance of Pixplot, the one that's running on this sample of our data, and you should be able to see it. And I'm going to share my screen at this point. Okay, Ryan has reminded me that there's going to be a little bit of visual lag, so I'll give that a second or two to load. What you should be seeing is kind of the home page of the Pixplot instance. And this is not running on the 2.5 total million examples. This is running on that small little experiment on this one Boston didactic educational publisher. And here we see the grid view of about the 1,300 images. So I just want to show you, and you can explore this at your own interest and on your own time, the different kind of tools that Pixplot gives you. So, and of course, all the credit to Doug Duhame, who's the developer of the Pixplot tool at the Yale Digital Humanities Library. Yale Digital Humanities Lab. HathiTrust Digital Library. There we go. So at the top right here, we have a date slider. So the dates for this, like the project, go from 1800 to about 1850. You can play around with the point size for the different JPEGs. And right now we're looking at everything in a grid, but you can also look at things by date. So since this example is for one publisher, you're gonna, there's certain years where what's survived in the archive or what's made it into HathiTrust are sort of more represented, but that's okay. But the really cool thing, and I'm mindful of the time here, so I'll just, just another minute or two playing around with this, is cluster images via UMAP dimensionality reduction up here in the top right. So basically that means each image has had another deep learning model applied to it, and it's been turned into a vector essentially. And this is the projection of those vectors in two-dimensional space. And that, in fact, was one of the takeaways of the project. We tried to vectorize all of our 2.5 million images, but it was sort of untractable, and it was hard to interpret it or tell if those were useful representations apart from a dedicated data visualization tool. So a huge takeaway is, for doing work on illustrations or images, you really need to have in mind what kind of data visualization tool do you want your data set to be ingested by, or how do you want to use it and view it? So this tool also lets you look at clusters. So over here on the left, I'm going to click on cluster 15, and then we're going to zoom in to this cluster. It's going to take a second to load. And up on the right, I'm going to click this little radio button here for adding jitter. Jitter is something handy. It basically doesn't let images smush on top of each other. And I'm detecting the Pixplot example going a little bit slower, probably because there's maybe some traffic on it now. But if we go over to this part of the crazy manifold in which similar images are in theory kept to one another, and images kind of cluster depending on their visual characteristics. It's not a science, but it can at least reveal some interesting things. We see, lo and behold, our little ship on fire image. And this is in fact the one from Paul Preston's Voyages, Travels and Remarkable Adventures as related by himself to the two boys and their friends in this Thomas Picton kind of copycat work. If I'm lucky, this one might be the one from, that's another one from Paul Preston. Yes, but here's the one from The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York Mariner. with an account of his travels around 3 parts of the globe, written by himself, with new designs on wood by Anderson. So even Defoe's title, written by himself, speaks to the different conception of authorship maybe in these types of works. All right, so there's our photo of our ship, or digital scan of our wood engraving of the ship catching on fire and blowing up. Great, so that's my demo of Pixplot and a sense of some of what this data set looks like, what we did to get to it, and how you might use it to start thinking about research questions of your own. Again, this image data is not publicly available. I hope to do more work in writing a paper in a dissertation chapter explaining, dissertation section explaining some of how this works, and I'll stop sharing maybe now. Oh, good. Thank you, Glenn, for taking back over, because I am out of time. But I have a few acknowledgments. I'll just leave those up. You can trust that I'll thank all those fine people, and then I will turn it over. But I look forward to talking in the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Stephen. Next up, we'll hear from Matthew J. Yoder and Dmitry Mozzherin at the University of Illinois. Take it away, guys.
Okay, I'll try. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, so Matt and I worked on with the HathiTrust, and I think it was a really great experience for us. Thank you for this opportunity. Work with Boris and Ryan was exceptionally fun, and I think we did interesting things together. So next slide, please. We will talk about biological scientific names. I'll tell a little bit what they are. Everybody probably know Homo sapiens. It is one of many scientific names that people use. And scientific names exist in 3 different levels. So altogether, scientific name is one of the oldest still used identifiers that is actively used in science for more than 250 years now. And in reality, more close to 1,000 years, because scientific names that we have now, they originated from Roman Empire, but they were formalized approximately a little more than 250 years ago, closer to 300 now, actually. And there was no, 250 years ago, there was one system, and after that, there was a new system. They overlap, they organically grow from one to another, and there was no one year when people switched. We can see old system used for another 50 years, and we can see names from new system go very far in the past, like in 300 years ago, 400 years ago, because again, it was not a completely new system. It was evolving. So what do we have? We have species on Earth. Species is something that is more art than science in definition. People take in account many different factors, and they devise that this particular group of organisms can be called species. And there is a fuzzy consensus about around 205 million of them. However, there is 7 million names for these 2.5 million species that exist in the world. And the reason is, one reason is that people change where some species exist. So species are in a genus and the species. So there are 2 parts for usual name. And if, for example, scientists decide that species have to be in a different genus, suddenly spelling of the name changes significantly. Sometimes people have realization that two different species were actually the same thing. And then name is changing so much that there is absolutely no lexical similarity between these two names, but they actually point to the same thing. So for this 2.5 million, we have 7 million currently used names and probably 10 million of names that we don't use anymore that point to those 2.5 million. So approximately 3 names per species. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but something like that. To complicate things further, these 7 million names do not have a very rigid way how they can be spelled, how people write them. There are quite a few variations how people can show a name in literature. And because of that, these 7 million actually become approximately 100 million different name streams, where somebody omits authorship, somebody adds authorship, somebody adds original authors and omit authors of a new combination, and sometimes opposite. Sometimes people put year, sometimes not, sometimes they make a mistake, sometimes they not knowing Latin very well, they make mistake in gender of the name, and then somebody fixes it. And plus, on top of all that, now in a digitization era, we have OCR that adds a huge amount of misspellings to on top of everything else. And why it is important? Because names are identifiers of all living things in the world, and we still do not have any other system. So for all information that we know about biology or biodiversity is connected to names. Therefore, if we are able to create an index of names in a literature, the same as we have like in the end of the book, and we can say, okay, where people mention Homo sapiens, for example, we can look and find all the information that connected to that. It is especially important because species aerial or species disappear, species change dramatically. Their zones where they live shrink, they migrate to different places, they become invasive species, and going through literature, we able through this index to go and find what people knew about the species 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and so on. And for that, we also need to know all the synonyms for all this. Like if you know one name, we also want to know all other names that people use for this particular species, if you want to work with it. Next slide, please. So first, we decided to use a project called Biodiversity Heritage Library. This is the largest specialized library, digital library of biological literature. They have about 200,000 volumes, about 60 million pages, and we did want to create a scientific name index because that is tremendously important for researchers and for general public. The Biodiversity Heritage Library is a gateway that is unprecedented in non-digital time. So now everybody can go there and find very old books, new books, and so on about biology. So we did it. We found approximately 200 million occurrences of scientific names. we found 12 million name strings, and 2 million of these taxon concept, or like species or other clades that are bigger than species or smaller. So first time we tried it 10 years ago, it was very cumbersome. It took us 45 days. I still shudder when I remember this time, and I never wanted to do it again, and never did. As a result, for 10 years, they had one experiment that was sometimes bad, sometimes good. And people would leave feedback, and we say, I'm sorry, we cannot do anything to help you because we are not going to spend other 45 days doing this job. And that wasn't good. So we decided to work on it, and created this program that allows to do this in one day. Actually, it takes us about 4 hours to go through 200,000 volumes, and then it takes about 10 hours to validate results that we got, to remove false positives. And that allows us significantly to make the job iterative, so we can constantly improve on the system. Next slide, please. So after we were happy with the Biodiversity Heritage Library, we saw a grant in on a HathiTrust webpage. We signed up for it, and we got the grant. And thanks to Boris and Ryan, we were able to work with 100 times bigger data than BHL. So we went through globally through whole HathiTrust. It is 17 million volumes, 6 billion pages. So we found approximately 100 times more occurrences. We that end up with the 30 million name strings and 5.5 million canonical forms, which is a normalized version of like all various spelling variants of name strings. So it took us 9 hours on work was running in parallel on 50 computers at HathiTrust, which was fantastic. So to go through 6 billion pages in 9 hours was great. And then it took us about a week to go and to verify data, to remove false positives. And on top of that, we went through results and filtered out books that don't seem to be biological, because sometimes we do have false positives. Next slide, please. So what can we do after this work? First of all, we do want to have a dramatic quality improvement. Now that we can do it very fast, we want to do things that were not possible before. For example, in biological literature, it is very, very popular to abbreviate names, like to mention genus and then write only genus as one letter, like H. sapiens, for example. And and this is like a dark matter of biology. About 25% of all names in biological literature is abbreviated, and right now it is extremely hard to find them. So we want to develop good algorithms to fix that. We want to work very well with the different languages, especially Romanic languages like French, Spanish, Italian, which are very similar to scientific names, and create more false positives. We want to work with the context. For example, some inventive biologists have names like habeas corpus or Oedipus complex. So a whole Laure literature is getting scientific names as a result. And we want to be able to work with names like this to figure out context in which a particular term was used and say, was it biological or not. And when we did all of that, we want to be able to create an index of everything. So that's all.
Thanks, Dima. Next up is Laure Thompson. Laure, take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. So just a quick shout out for my other collaborators on this project. This was done primarily at Cornell University with David Memno and Michelle Alia. And so the big question and sort of goal of this project that was completed in the sort of last year in 2019 to 2020 is what's really in HathiTrust and how easy is it to build a collection, a large, again, collection of genre fiction. So particularly thinking about works that are in copyright. And so I'll be generally looking at, in this case, science fiction, rather than sort of any other space. But again, this is sort of a more broad question of if I have some collection of works and say a list, how would I go about finding these volumes in HathiTrust or even knowing how many volumes might exist within the space? Next slide. And so the big part here that we were relying on really the bare bones that you could expect for a work, which would be the author and title. Note that there's a big discrepancy here between the way my sort of curated list is operating and the general view of a typical library catalog. It's not surprising, it's just sort of a immediate disconnect that kept coming up was that the catalog is going to be operating at volume, and so edition level works. So you'll have the same, a work can be published many different times over the decades, even though it was it isn't out of copyright, at least in some editions. But we're looking for the sense of how many copies are there at the work level, which is not inherently going to be encoded in your typical marked file. And so we did two steps. One was how do we make our list at all, since there are many science fiction works in this case, or science fiction here, I actually want speculative fiction, my apologies. And so here we're relying on a very nice fan-built database that covers genre information, as well as providing a bunch of other additional metadata to help us understand what has actually been incorporated into HathiTrust over time, as opposed to just sort of these are everything, getting the sense of what maybe the first publication date is to a work, as well as what kind of awards has it received within sort of the genre space itself. So our giant list that we do not expect remotely to cover everything of includes over 18,000 works by over 3,000 authors, ranging from 1900 to 2010. 2010 is chosen because it's effectively, sort of 2008 is about the last date you really get sort of reliable digitization efforts from Google Books. And that's sort of the expectation of while there are going to be lots of works uncovered, especially in these sort of last decade on this sort of fan site, because it's in part used for tracking reading, what books you've read over time, it's going to be less helpful for marking how well sort of the genre is covered across the decades. But again, particularly emphasizing this sort of in copyright time, in part also because the genres in question of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, which I'm going to say are sort of the big sort of keystones in the higher umbrella of speculative fiction, are themselves not very well formed, or are themselves more sort of modern genres that are not fully developed in the 1900s, the early 1900s. And so with that, we have a large list of things. It's novels, it's also collections and novellas. Short fiction should be unsurprisingly not well covered. And like any curation setup with this sort of list, it's not without its own biases. It's strongly sort of leaning towards science fiction fantasy, with generally more coverage for newer things than necessarily older things, and horror is just generally lower in number. Next slide. And so the big part that we were trying to do is, and like why we wanted to work with HathiTrust here, is how can we go about at our best for really sort of doing a query across all of the catalog records in HathiTrust. We'll be wanting to eventually operate and use, find the volumes that have extracted features, but that's sort of the big first step of how would I even know the HathiTrust IDs for the volumes that I would be interested in, and how do I even know when something's not there? Because that's sort of this big conundrum for understanding how, like, HathiTrust has a lot of promise and value when there are millions and millions of volumes, but if you're trying to study science fiction over time, it's really important that, one, you can find the science fiction that's in HathiTrust and really understand that what its coverage is of what you're trying to actually study. Is it covering all the decades? Is it covering just the sort of the big hitting authors, or is it who's missing or extremely underrepresented in the space? So through research, we ended up finding about 3,000 distinct works and a bit over 5,000 volumes. And the automated, this is going to include two components. One, our automated search, which was just using effectively Boris crafted a nice regex that could query against the database. And that produced, again, around on the order of 5,000 work volume pairs, but only about 4,000 of these were actually good matches. And we had another clear sort of 500 mismatches. These were all sort of manually checked. And then through a non-exhaustive sort of separate manual search that I had done at different points, because in a sort of previous work, I had collected 1,200 distinct science fiction works from HathiTrust that in itself led me to these questions, because it was far from intended coverage. It was trying to see how much I could find, and eventually just sort of based on the sort of whim of what I was searching for and which authors I was attempting to cover as opposed to what was generally there. It led us to sort of some big views of what was really mismatched and sort of what were causing issues with our automated search in general. For like when we got false positives of these are things that are in our, these are wrong volumes for particular work. And those were particularly just the classic things that happen, particularly in popular fiction, not just speculative fiction, but quite broadly, that there can be distinct works with very similar titles. This is especially true for a series, see Dune, Dune Messiah, House of Dune. We have all of these sort of cases where Dune easily overlaps. It has the same author, so again, or it might have a related author, but these sort of overlaps cause issues with regex, and these can easily be fixed if you have the idea, if there's sort of the notion that you have a positive match, and so you can often filter when it's like, okay, these works have been matched to multiple volumes. It's sort of not the worst to filter, but another part that was also an issue is sort of the matches for overlapping content in the case of shorter fictions that could be included in anthologies, or even just the point that you can actually have works with the exact same name. See a novella getting converted into a novel. This happened with Ender's Game, for instance, that you can in fact have just these works have the same, they are identical from the author title view. And that's a small niche issue. That's not too much of a problem, but really the sort of overlapping causes sort of a classic problem when you're getting omnibuses or larger collections that might include the volume in question you're looking at, but it's not the volume, it's not the work, the work in itself is not a full times that volume. In terms of what we didn't find, some of these were just sort of the, what did we miss that you could find manually? A big issue throughout is that some works are going to be cataloged from their series view as a serial record as opposed to a sort of work level record. The sort of big one that we found was Lord of the Rings, in part because these were collections that were sold and printed in the trilogy form, and so therefore very rightfully were in a sort of were cataloged as a serial as opposed to an individual volume. But we didn't find those, and it actually led to some additional conflation because our search wasn't looking at the series number that a volume could have. And even in this collection, there were some volumes that were missing which number they were, and they weren't actually the full anthology in one volume. It was just the two towers, and that you could only see from a content search. Additionally, other pieces that are just sort of common, and there'll be issues with regex, but are just sort of a general sort of problem when trying to do these sort of fuzzy level searching, is that there's title and author variation. Additionally, you have the very common problem of which author name was actually listed in the catalog record between legal versus pen names, as well as alternate titles that can exist for works. This is particularly true for volumes, like for, since we're operating explicitly in the English language for this set, we did find other things, but that was sort of, our goal was just in English because we weren't hitting against all the other language names, the language title variations, but between the British, UK sort of publications and the English and the American English publications, that you get different titles, and that in itself causes problems for how you find these. But you also have subtitling issues that come into play as well for did the subtitle get included or not in the search title. Next. So basically there were a lot of issues, but like we found a list, we got over 3,000 volumes. That was far more than my attempt where I got 1,200, and it was a lot more automated than slowly searching through via the catalog, whether I was using at one point a WorldCat prototype, but even the HathiTrust catalog itself, and just having to go manually through by author and title and try to do these searches, when again, I might be missing something because of a Unicode character or whatever else can be at play with these sort of textual searches. Unsurprisingly, HathiTrust has a lot of novels, and that was what it was in our main search. But excitingly, there are a lot of collections and anthologies. And note that our list, in fact, didn't have that many because Worlds Without and the fan database that we were using is not very sort of focused on those works compared to some other fan databases out there. And so from just a separate hand search and related work, we found another 200 volumes for science fiction related anthologies. And so that's sort of an exciting direction that HathiTrust can really play, because libraries are often do collect and sort of have in their collections anthology works that are not necessarily true for other popular fiction types. We nicely do capture the fairly prolific authors in these sort of work level searches. And maybe unsurprisingly, but sort of an important point here is that out of copy works are really the ones that are overrepresented at the volume level. The sort of surprising pieces that we ran into were, one, we do actually still have prolific authors with little to no representation in this collection. They're largely sort of in the later decades, but these are still like in the 80s, and they're operating like the 80s and 90s now. There was a pen named James Axler, Tanith Lee, CJ Sherry, and Mercedes Lackey. Again, a bunch of these authors are also explicitly women, which is sort of another piece that's some of the most prolific women are not well represented in these collections. We also miss one of the most decorated science fiction writers in history, Connie Willis, and we only have 2 of her works. And she has at least, I believe, 12 or 13 Hugo and Locus Awards in her name. So that's another sort of question of, well, why? I mean, some of this is, again, if it's based on what potentially Google Books digitized, that might have to do more with that these books were checked out. So that would be why you wouldn't have gotten them digitized, as opposed to sort of, and that most more sort of institution digitization efforts have rightfully been related to out of copyright work. And so just another shout out for one really surprising piece that matters for thinking about studying science fiction. Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and its sequel were both missing in HathiTrust, and we couldn't find them. And that was a surprise when talking to people who are actively trying to use HathiTrust for studying science fiction. And then one more, I believe, is sort of, I think we're hitting the end of things. And so that was sort of the big piece of what we ended up doing in this work, was just trying to understand what we could find when we're using catalog records. But a big sort of a second step, and I think something that's very valuable, is because we have extracted features, which give us a sort of non-copyright infringing view of the contents of these works, we can further distinguish what texts are first the ones we're looking for in terms of works and finding near duplicates. But this might be a way to further expand the searches for genre or other related material if we find the right way to do signatures that where the catalog records themselves might not tell us enough because either it's maybe a record that has some misplaced or it has some slightly different information. Maybe the author's not in there, there was a typo. There's a number of reasons why records can be sort of slightly off and not being combined, but maybe this is another way for a search, if you have some set of books, finding related ones and being able to expand the search when the catalog may not work enough on its own. And again, I think they're both extremely valuable together. The catalog helped us, again, like was discussed in previous projects, it helped us filter out non-book related mediums. It turns out there are a bunch of operas and plays of science fiction and fantasy works out there, and those can generally be filtered by some through metadata, but also just if you look at the file, if you look at the contents itself, there isn't a lot of text compared to what you'd expect for a novel. And so this was our big hope. So the nice part here for the 2 sort of examples I've shown you, one, we can show that for the work, The Chessmen of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, that we can find through a signature view of a volume of literally just sort of driving it down from its contents to a small vector. Think of how you could hypothetically put this on Pixplot, but we don't have nice pictures, unfortunately. And seeing it also matches to some relating works and the things that are nearby. As opposed to when we switched to a anthology where we had a lot of anthologies called the Hugo winners from the catalog view. This is just because it's a serial work. There are Hugo winners for every year, going back a number of years. And that nice part here is that all of those anthologies were mismatches. They do not match each other. They're not close matches in the sort of near duplicate sense. But we also get hints again of other possible anthologies that might have overlap with works that have fit in both of them. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you for listening and happy to, I guess we're going on to the Q&A now, if there's time.
Thanks, Laure. I think, Glenn, now I'm tagging you in.
Yes, thank you very much, Ryan. And thanks to all the presenters. So we're well over time. Aaron, how much leeway do we have?
Sorry, we don't have another session after this, so if your presenters want to keep going and our audience is staying on the Zoom call, I think you're free to keep going with some questions.
Great. So sure, we have a couple of questions in the chat that I will read out. I know that Aduramo had to leave, but I think everyone else is here. Let me make sure I get the first question. I think this was for Stephen about the how search through extracted images could be supported with metadata and not just with the sort text with the image, but with the images themselves. So I think that's a question about an image search engine. So Stephen, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's the ultimate dream. I mean, I think working with books, the initial questions are probably best founded when it's coming from metadata related to the volume, but that's exactly what we wanted. I mean, implicitly in a Pixplot type setup where there's a lower dimensional representation of an image, that's a kind of metadata, but it's not really interpretable. In another stage of this, I would love to have maybe a proposal about the standard image classifiers would, give you kind of different objects and scenes in the world, but they weren't trained with 19th century landscapes and things like that. So there almost would need to be another labeling and data set creation all on its own for that. But I would love, I think there's some low-hanging fruit, like the dimensions of the book. An image in a tiny little book for kids is certainly different than a scientific atlas. So annotating with that kind of thing. And then maybe basic camera data from the scanning. I mean, you can see the big differences in the coloration, which is part based on the scanning, part based on the physical conditions. So I think a lot of things intersect here, both like object classification, the physical condition of these different copies, and the physical dimension of the book as an object.
Great, thank you. And then there's one more question for you, Stephen, and that's about whether there's some way aside from flipping through all of the pages of all of the books to find images. Is there some software that can do that without flipping through the pages?
Well, that's the hope of our project. So we did it in an automated way. I realized I didn't state that quite maybe upfront enough. But I think the question was maybe going after how to cut down on the space of which pages might have illustrations. And that's kind of where it's been done before, but we exploited this trick where Google has some metadata related to their digitization where pages are tagged as having an image on the page. So we didn't look at anything other than that. So that's the main trick there. But you're right, like without HTRC's help for the average researcher, you can't really do this kind of work, which is why it would be great to think longer term about ways to do that or to facilitate that.
Good, thanks. And then there's a question from Stacy. Hi, Stacy. I think I'll take this one myself. This is about reuse of the workflow in creating all of these data sets, but also the reuse in the data itself. So that sounds like a softball question. We in HTRC have done some facilitation of reuse, not as much as we would like to, but we do have data sets that were created by collaborators, including ACS collaborators, that we document and and host. I think it's fair to say that there's a fairly high bar of what, first of all, what will be of interest and to the large number of people, and also what can be well documented and cataloged and presented in a way that will be useful. But yes, sure, we do some of that, and I think we've talked about doing that with a couple of the data sets that you've seen presented here, both the biological names and the image data set, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know that we've actually managed to do that in a good way yet, but we do talk about it. And then for the workflows, I think it's, rather than the entire workflow, I think it's fair to say that the individual pieces, the components of the workflow, are things that we guard carefully internally, but I think it's probably fair to say that we don't document them or present them to users in general, although there are some exceptions, and you'll be seeing a few more exceptions of those, that sort of thing. So, all right, can we search the OCR if you cluster it? This is for Stephen again.
I can answer that verbally. So we kept pretty light metadata for each image. Basically, the only way back to the text is through the unique Hati ID. So you'd have to set up some sort of other workflow or script so you can kind of find the images you're interested in, and then you would have to then go through the IDs associated with them and get the OCR that way through API calls.
Good, thanks. Okay, so since we are so short on time, let me declare this the end of the Q&A and thank our presenters once again. I thought that was really great. I love seeing all of them, and I can't get enough of these projects. I also wanted to tell the community, through everyone who's assembled here, that we will have another call for ACS projects coming very soon. This is a special call. Ryan presented our usual modus operandi as not having money attached. This one actually is funded by the Mellon Foundation, a really generous grant that we just announced a few weeks ago. And the ACS program is going to play a key role in that grant. We will be supporting with both funding and with the typical ACS collaborative support projects that focus on under-resourced and marginalized textual communities, and in part identifying some gaps in the HathiTrust collection. So we've seen a little bit today of some of the gaps that have already been identified. But in the next 2 years or so, we'll be focusing on that in a much bigger way, in part through this advanced collaborative support program. So once again, thank you very much, everyone. It's been great to have you all here, and we look forward to seeing you around the community.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone for attending our session, and just note that we do have our community Slack available, and you can request a link to join that in the chat or at feedback@issues.hathitrust.org if you're not in there, and to complete the survey, and I believe a link for that has been shared in the chat. Thanks.
Thanks for your support, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was good.
Sure thing. Just making sure there's no lingering questions or anything here, and then I think you're free to sign off here.
We don't want to sign off while we're being recorded, then everyone will see. Maggie, I like your corgi.